Hi everyone, Thomas Desmond here, developer advocate at Sitecore, and today I want to talk about component level data fetching with Sitecore JSS and Next.js. I think that this is a really cool feature because it really changes the way that we can architect our applications and do data fetching in Next.js. So we're going to take a look at what data fetching looks like in a vanilla Next.js application. We'll see how Sitecore JSS expands upon that so that we can do component level data fetching. You'll see code examples so that you can learn how to do this in your own Sitecore JSS applications. And last, we'll look at the advanced incremental static regeneration feature so that you can see how that fits in with component level data fetching. Let's jump in. All right, so what I want to start out with is how you fetch data in a vanilla Next.js application. This is an application that's not using Sitecore JSS. Looking at this diagram, I have a parent page at the top. That page hosts a component, and even our component hosts another component that's the grandchild. So this could be a potential architecture for your front-end application where you have a parent, child, and then a grandchild component in there. So how does data fetching work in a vanilla Next.js application? Well, in vanilla Next.js, you're only able to do page-level data fetching. So that would mean that we would need to fetch all of our data at the parent level. If we want to pass data down into one of our components, we need to pass that down from the parent. And if we have another component even underneath that, we'd have to pass the data down again. So with vanilla Next.js, you're limited to fetching all your data at the page level and passing that down to your components. What really bugs me about this is that means that we can't really have fully independent components. All of our components have to rely on the parent page to be able to fetch all the data and pass the data down to them. And that's what really bugs me, is it makes it difficult to make fully modular and independent components. If you're not familiar with making modular independent front ends, check out my previous video on component-driven design and building out modular front ends. How does this all change when we go to component level data fetching with Sitecore JSS and Next.js? Well, looking at that same hierarchy where we have the parent page, a child component, and then a grandchild component, with component level data fetching, we can fetch just the data we need at each component. So now, at the page level, we can pick out just the data that we need for the page. For our component, we can use our get static props, get server-side props in our components to fetch just the data we need. And even at that grandchild level, we have a get static props, or we have the get server-side props, able to pull in just the data we need at that level. No more fetching it all at the page and having to pass it down to our components. This means that we can make more independent modular components. They all are able to independently capture all their data and display that out to the page. Now let's take a look at what it takes to implement component level data fetching in your Sitecore JSS applications. So luckily, implementing component level data fetching is actually pretty similar to doing page level data fetching. As I mentioned, we're still going to use the get static props and get server-side props. Those are our methods that do static site generation and server-side rendering respectively. So we still use those inside of our components, but the big changes are going to be in the return type. So we'll take a look at that in the code of how our return types change to support component level data fetching. And also, we're going to be using the rendering UID for our components. This is a unique UID for each component. So we need to use that inside of the actual React function. That's the function that we actually write our HTML in. So we need to have that rendering UID so that we can call out to Sitecore JSS and ask for the data that we need for the component. This will make a lot more sense when we look at the code, but essentially we're going to need to have different return types and use our rendering UID to capture the data that we need inside of our component. Let's take a look at some code. Here I am in VS Code looking at a component that I am doing component level data fetching in. You can see that I have get static props on line 20. So this component is going to be statically generated. And remember that return type that I mentioned? We have get static component props here as our return type. This is that special return type to Sitecore JSS for using get static props inside of a component. Line 21, I'm actually pulling out data that's being passed in from XM Cloud to this component. On line 22, I'm calling fetch sessionized data. That happens on line 17. It calls out to my API and returns the text as a string. I then return that string on line 23, and that's the data that I need inside my component that I'm doing component level data fetching on. Now let's take a look at how we use that data inside the component. Scrolling down here to the component itself, I have my default rendering for my component. And what you're going to see here that's specific to Sitecore JSS and specific to component level data fetching is line 35, use component props. This is saying that I have done component level data fetching somewhere in my component, and I want to now capture that data so I can use it in my HTML. What we're passing in as the argument is the rendering UID of our component. I have access to that as part of my props. I'm passing that in, and I'm telling use component props here that it should expect a string as the return type. Just to reiterate that, this use component props is special to Sitecore JSS. It takes in the rendering UID of our component. This is the unique ID of a component, and it's going to tell JSS that this component should have gotten data already during component level data fetching, and we want to get that data. So that's going to be the string that I had in that fetch sessionized data that we got earlier. Something else that I want to show is that component data object. That is my properties here in the arguments of my React function. So component data is actually made up of the rendering, which is a component rendering, as well as the fields. And those fields are what's coming from XM Cloud. So depending on your situation, those might be optional. But what you are going to probably have is that rendering, because that's the rendering object that we need so that we can get the UID of our component and pass that into use component props. And just to share it, because I don't think I've shown the top of the page yet, but all of these imports are important and they're coming from the Sitecore JSS Next.js library. So these are all specific to Sitecore JSS with Next.js. And something that's come up when I was building out this page is that this is a speakers page. It's a component inside of one of my other pages, but that speaker page could update. Our speakers could change. The data coming back from that sessionized API could change. So I want to be able to update that data without having to do a full rebuild of my application. And what's great is that Vercel and Next.js have this really cool feature called Incremental Static Regeneration that lets us rebuild our pages when new data comes in from our APIs without doing a full rebuild of our application. So how does ISR or incremental static regeneration work when you're doing component level data fetching? Well, the way that it works is that you're actually going to inherit ISR from the parent page. We do not implement ISR at a component level. It's going to inherit it from the page. In order to implement ISR, you need to add a revalidate property as what you return from getStaticProps. But since we're not implementing that at a component level, we're inheriting that ISR from our parent. So let me take a look at my parent page. So here I am in the parent page that actually hosts my speaker component. And you'll see on line 67 that it has revalidate set to 5, meaning that we actually have turned on ISR and we really want this frequent updates to our pages. So this is pretty cool. We can still do incremental static regeneration when doing component level data fetching. One thing to be aware though of is that it's not super flexible. Because this parent page could host many components, all of our components that inherit from this parent page are going to have ISR enabled. So there's really no way to turn it off at a component level if we want it in some components but not others. So if you turn it on at the parent page, it's going to be turned on for all components underneath that. But that's what I wanted to cover today. I wanted to look at component level data fetching because I think it is a great feature for really allowing us to architect our applications in an independent and modular way. No longer are we having to rely on fetching all of our data at the page level. We're able to go into our exact components where we need the data, fetch it there, and use it there with minor changes just to that return types, as well as making sure that we use the rendering UID to actually capture that data and display it out in our components. If you enjoyed this video, please leave it a like, give it a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel so that you can keep up with future videos as well. Thanks.